I would like to welcome you to our second online event of our Krasnow Global Affairs series here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I trust you are healthy and safe in these days of global crisis and economic turmoil. We are all suffering, though some of us a lot more than others. But as you know, the 6 years of global war from 1939 to 1945, they were even more horrible. In total, up to 87 million people died worldwide. In Russia alone, up to 27 million died. And of course, there were at least 6 million people who died and who were killed in the Holocaust. And much of the world was destroyed. When the war in Europe came to an end in early May 1945, 75 years ago, almost everyone was relieved, both the victors and the defeated. The war in Asia, of course, only ended in August 1945. After the explosion of 2 atomic bombs over Japan. I'm KLAUS LARRES. I'm the Richard Krasnow Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC Chapel Hill. I started organizing the Krasnow Global Affairs series in 2012. And since then, we have had almost 100 events on global politics, history, economics, and security affairs. We've been able to welcome very interesting and distinguished speakers. And normally, of course, our events are live. You can watch all of our events on our famous YouTube channel. That is youtube.com/KrasnowUNC. And the event today, we will also put on our YouTube channel. And these are exciting events. All our events are most exciting. So I can recommend to watch them as often as you possibly can. And I can also recommend the separate 5-minute interviews I conduct with all of our speakers. They are also on our YouTube channel. We also have a website, which of course is worth looking at. That is krasnowevents.com. And we have a global mailing list. Please send me an email if you wish to join our mailing list. There's also a contact form on our webpage where you can sign up to the mailing list. Today is only our second online event ever. And it is about the most important event, the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. Today we will talk about Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and FDR, the end of the Second World War in Europe, cause and legacy. We have 6 distinguished speakers who will talk to us about different aspects of the Second World War and its end and legacy. As there is such rich expertise on the Second World War here at the University of North Carolina, exceptionally all our speakers today are UNC professors. I will introduce each of them briefly before they give their short initial presentations of something like 8 minutes each. After they have spoken, I will also briefly say something about Britain and the role of Churchill. The procedure today is as follows. We will start with short presentations of each of our 6 speakers. Then I will have a couple of questions for them. And after that, as always, we open it up to questions from you, the audience. Our global audience consists of both students and scholars, as well as many members of the global general public. There are many people from the US and North Carolina, of course, watching us today. But there are also many people from continental Europe and from the UK, including actually my 14-year-old daughter, Steffi, who is logged on from Belfast in Northern Ireland. But I hear there are also people from Australia and from Asia who are watching us today. A very warm welcome to all of you. As to your questions for our speakers, please submit your questions in writing by using the chat function. Krasnow Senior Assistant Will Yoder will select your questions and read them out for our speakers to answer. Please be so kind as to mention your name and location when you submit your questions in writing to our speakers. We will try to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. I hope this procedure sounds okay to you. And let's begin with our first speaker. Our first speaker was meant to be Professor Gerhard Weinberg, but as Gerhard Weinberg is still trying to log on, I would say we go to the nominally second speaker, who now is our first speaker, and this is Lloyd KRAMER. Professor Lloyd KRAMER is a distinguished member of the UNC History Department. For many years, Lloyd was chairman of the department, and for all his sins, he actually appointed me in 2012, which I think was a great idea. At present, Lloyd is the director of the Carolina Public Humanities Program at UNC. Lloyd KRAMER is an expert of the history of France, and he has written many well-known books on French history. Today, he will talk to us about the importance of Charles de Gaulle and how France first dealt with defeat and then with its reconstruction after the war. Lloyd, over to you.
Thank you, Klaus. And I feel like I'm stepping into Gerhard's territory, and he will join us momentarily. But I want to say a few things about the impact of the Second World War in France. And I want to make basically 5 points and try to give some sense of why this event had such an upheaval, was such an upheaval in French culture. The German invasion of France and the collapse of the French government in 1940 may well be the most devastating event that the French people have ever experienced. And it may well have been far more traumatic even than its revolution or Napoleonic wars. The collapse of France surprised everyone in 1940, in part because the French had withstood 4 years of German military assaults during the First World War. And now suddenly in 5 or 6 weeks, the French collapsed. And I think one of the best ways to explore this is to look at Marc Bloch's famous book, Strange Defeat, which gives you a sense of the confusion, the chaos, the despair that gripped France in the summer of 1940. And there are other books that I would recommend, including the great novel by Irène Nemirovsky, Suite Française, which will give you a sense of the complete despair and chaos that swept across France in the summer of 1940. So that is the first point I want to make, that this war created an unprecedented upheaval in the lives of virtually everyone in France, both in the Vichy-controlled South and in the German-controlled North. And French national pride was destroyed in this event. And the despair of this experience explains the second key point I want to make, which is that the crushing French defeat created the context in which Charles de Gaulle could emerge as a key national leader. In contrast to the other leaders we're talking about today, people like Hitler and Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill, de Gaulle was a relatively obscure French military commander before the war, and he had never been a prominent political leader. But because de Gaulle vehemently rejected Charles Pétain's Vichy regime, he became the de facto voice of free France. And in June of 1940, when de Gaulle arrived in London, he grasped the mantle of French nationalism. And I want to just share very briefly, if I can, a speech that he presented in June of 1918. Okay, so this is de Gaulle in June of 1918, June 18th, 1940. The leaders who for many years have been at the head of the French armies have formed a government. The government alleging the defeat of our armies has made contact with the enemy in order to stop the fighting. We were overwhelmed. But has the last word been said? Must hope disappear? Is defeat final? No. Believe me, I tell you, nothing is lost for France is not alone. She has a vast empire behind her. She can align with the British Empire that holds the sea and continues to the fight. So he goes on to say, whatever happens, the flame of the French resistance must not be extinguished and will not be extinguished. So this leads to the third point I want to make. In addition to affirming French nationalism, de Gaulle gave the French people a choice by calling for resistance. And so a resistance movement gradually evolved in France in the period after, especially 1941. This was why it was so difficult. Everybody in France had to make a choice, either to actively collaborate or to join the resistance. But in fact, most people simply sought to survive. And if you want to get a sense of the ethical dilemmas that this posed, I would strongly suggest watching this amazing French television series called A French Village, which is available on Hulu, and it is great entertainment and historical television while you're isolated alone in a room. But everywhere in France, people had to make choices. And I think this explains why French existentialism emerged as the dominant philosophy in France after 1945, because the existentialists stress that we must each define ourselves by the choices we make. And this leads me to my fourth point about the legacy of World War II, because one of the legacies was the complex relationship between de Gaulle, Roosevelt, and Churchill. The French who supported de Gaulle were extremely disappointed that the United States did not come to the assistance of France in 1940. They remembered how the French had come to the assistance of the Americans in 1781 and helped the Americans gain their independence from a foreign occupying power. But this frustration with the Americans grew even stronger after the Americans recognized the Vichy regime and exchanged ambassadors. And this continued until 1942, a relationship with Vichy. So the relations between de Gaulle and Roosevelt were never good, and they became even more vexed after the time of the invasion in Normandy, because de Gaulle felt excluded from much of the military planning. He actually went to Normandy and arrived in Bayeux on June 12th and gave a speech, but he was always in some sense on the outside of the military planning. But he did insist that the French should arrive first in Paris, and so he was present very shortly after the French liberation of Paris on August the 25th, and he gave another famous speech in which he affirmed French nationalism. And I want to very briefly share one more speech, and this one is August 1945. Why do you wish us to hide the emotion which seizes us, all men and women? And then he says, no, we will not hide this emotion. There are minutes which go beyond our poor lives. Paris, Paris, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated, liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the help of the French armies, with the support and the help of all France, France, only France, the real France, the eternal France. You can see he didn't mention the Americans or the British, and he was claiming to represent true France. This created a lot of resentment among the Americans, and it also was intensified later when he was not recognized as the leader of the French government until October of 1944. And finally, my final point is that the war, although it created this alliance, created somewhat a resentment between ordinary French people and the Americans. Many reports from American soldiers at the time complained that the French were poor or hungry or dirty. Many of the American soldiers viewed most French women as prostitutes, and this created a lot of resentment among the French population. But in the end, the relationship survived and flourished. And I would finally mention one final point. There was resentment at elite levels because Roosevelt wanted the French to give up their empire, and de Gaulle opposed this for obvious reasons. He and Churchill opposed giving up the empire. So for all of these reasons, the legacy of World War II deeply affected French-American relationships and also created legacies more widely in French culture. But the most enduring part of the alliance was a shared commitment to human rights, and that endured after 1945.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. That's very enlightening. Can I just ask you, how did the French actually cope with the fact that part of their country was occupied by a pro-Nazi regime, and the other country was actually conquered and occupied by the Germans? How did that traumatize the French people for after the war?
It created a legacy of resentments, both in the South and the North, because there was so much anger about those in the South who collaborated with the Vichy regime. But it also created an enduring legacy in the North, because of the split between the Gaullists and the communists as part of the resistance. So there was a split between those who opposed the Nazis, as well as between those who collaborated with the Nazis and with the resistance.
The more miraculous perhaps that the Germans and the French have founded such a close friendship within the context of the European communities and the European Union.
And I would say one amazing point, that when Hitler ordered the German commander to destroy Paris in August 1944, he refused to do that. And that was one of the great contributions, I would say, of the German army. They did not destroy Paris, because if they had, there would have been a legacy of bitterness that would have been very difficult to resolve.
Thank you very much, Lloyd KRAMER. And our next speaker is Professor Gerhard Weinberg. Professor Gerhard Weinberg is a professor emeritus at UNC, and Professor Weinberg is the author of a seminal massive diplomatic and military history of the Second World War, as well as of many other publications. I think Gerhard Weinberg is the only one of our speakers today who actually served as a soldier towards the end of the Second World War. He is a veteran of the war. And I think Gerhard will forgive me when I say that he is not a spring chicken anymore. Gerhard was born in Germany, in Hanover, in 1928, and 10 years later, in 1938, he and his parents managed to escape. They first went to the UK, and then in 1941 to the United States. Gerhard served in the US Army during the occupation of Japan in 1946 and 1947. It is, of course, a tremendous pleasure to have Gerhard among our distinguished speakers today. Today, Gerhard will now talk about why the Allies won the Second World War and why Hitler and Nazi Germany lost the war. Over to you, Gerhard Weinberg.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Gerhard,
let me first apologize because this is the first time that I'm involved in this kind of operation. My technology is still a few decades behind. To understand why and how Germany was defeated in World War II, one has to first at least pay a little attention to why they started it. Hitler's aim was a twofold, interrelated one, that the German people were going to have more living space, eventually the whole globe, number one. And number two, from this whole globe, all Jews were to disappear after they had been exterminated. In the beginning of the war, things seemed to go well. In combination with the Soviet Union, Germany defeated Poland, occupied Denmark, seized Norway. I'll come to that back to that in a moment. Conquered Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and was able to defeat France. You've already heard something about that, but a critical part was that the American people in 1920 repudiated the commitment to France, which would have meant hundreds of thousands of American troops in France in 1940. However, the Germans in the campaign for Norway lost a substantial portion of their navy, were completely dependent upon the Air Force to help them invade Britain, and that Air Force was defeated in the summer of 1940 in the Battle of Britain. Originally, Germany, since that from the German point of view is where there lots of space was, planned to invade the Soviet Union still in the fall of 1940, but with the trouble with Britain, Hitler made two interrelated decisions. He would invade the Soviet Union in 1941 in the summer, and to get the Brits out, he would promise the Japanese to go to war with the United States. The Japanese had planned to invade in Southeast Europe, the colonial areas, in 1946, after the Americans had given up their bases in the Philippines. But Hitler promised the Japanese that if they struck now and knocked at the Brits now, he would join them in war with the United States. The invasion of the Soviet Union was indeed launched in the summer of 1941, but it involved basic misassumptions about that country. Hitler and those around him shared the view that the Slavic people of that country were racially inferior, and as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution, were now ruled by incompetent Jews. Since Germany had been able to defeat a dynastically ruled Russia in the First World War, now that they were ruled only by incompetence, it would be much easier than it had been. The problem turned out to be, and this was a critical element for understanding the Second World War, that as the Germans invaded, they won what one might call local victories. But by August of 1941, it was clear that the Soviet Union, even if defeated in specific engagements, was not going to collapse. And under those circumstances, there then followed in Eastern Europe years of fighting, which absorbed the majority at all times of Germany's army, and which eventually was totally crushed. The decision, I would argue, was not this particular battle or that particular battle, but the ability of the leadership to keep the country together. Hitler was going to have a special railroad that ran from Berlin to Vladivostok, the Russian port on the Pacific Ocean, a little over 5,000 miles. There was no way that in the face of determined Russian resistance, German soldiers were going to march to Vladivostok. Hitler had always planned to go to war with the United States because that was a part of the world that Germany would conquer, and already in 1937 had begun to develop the intercontinental bomber and the super battleships for that. As I said, he got the Japanese to go to war and immediately went to war also. Again, as in the estimates of the Soviet Union, the estimates of the United States were preposterously off. Hitler, like all leaders, acted on what he thought and believed and expected, not what others might think. And he was as certain that the United States was a hopelessly weak country, which with its normally democratic procedures, a mixture of races living there, a large imagined role for Jews in it, a country that in his view had played no role of any significance in the First World War, it could easily be defeated. This also turned out to be, as I'm sure everybody in the audience knows, a misassessment on which Germany acted. And the United States proceeded to mobilize its people and its industry and participated in military operations which were not always tactically successful, but strategically were successful in North Africa, then in Sicily, then in Italy, and then the invasion across the Channel in Normandy. From there, in spite of German counterattacks, the Western Allies drove into Germany from the west at about the same time as the Red Army moved into Germany from the east. And in one respect, one could suggest that the Germans were lucky to end the war and lose when they did, because if they had fought on a few more months, the first atomic bombs would, as planned, have landed on Germany. If one asks, well, what did this all in the long term mean for the German people? One has to keep in mind how totally different the war experience of World War II was for them from World War I. World War I was fought 98% outside Germany. But in World War II, Allied armies came into Germany. In World War I, the Germans had started the bombing of cities, especially of England. They proceeded to do this again in World War II, but the Allies then figured if that's what they so desperately want the war to be, they would bomb German cities. At the end of the Second World War, therefore, unlike after the First, when only a portion of Germany was occupied, at the end of the Second World War, all of it was occupied. Instead of leaving the less than 50-year-old Germany as a unit, as they did after the First World War, after the Second, they divided it. Instead of just occupying a portion of it for a dozen years, they occupied all of it, and Americans staged a farewell parade in the American sector of Berlin in 1994, 49 years after the war. And instead of being admitted to the League of Nations 8 years after the First World War, it took 28 years after World War II before Germany was admitted to the United Nations. And unlike the earlier one, did not get a seat on the council. The people of Germany, having experienced war in a fundamentally different way from the prior one that many of them had lived through or participated in, not only rallied to a kind of parliamentary democracy that many of them had had doubts about after the First World War, they also became, I think it would be fair to say, the most pacifist inclined people on the European continent. While in subsequent decades, and especially most recently with the passage of time, there is a small number, increasing unfortunately number, who have their doubts about all this. The majority remains convinced. As for the other major aim, well, the two major aims, instead of expanding the living space of the Germans around the globe, Germany ended up being almost a quarter smaller than it had been when Hitler became chancellor in 1933. They managed to kill 1/3 of the 18 million Jews on Earth, killed 6 million. But the other side of this was that for the first time in 2,000 years, the Jews then were able to get a state, a country of their own again. So the people in Germany on that area also began to change when in a few decades ago, Germany of all countries accepted Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union, where they were then being persecuted. It is a different country in a different Europe, and none of this erases the losses, the devastation, and the horrors of the Second World War, but in the long run has proved at least helpful and productive for the surviving German population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerhard Weinberg. Very interesting and enlightening. Can I just ask you, how difficult was it in 1938 when you and your parents escaped from Nazi Germany, first to the UK and then to the United States? How difficult was it to get out?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing that question. Okay. Louder, please.
Yes, in 1938, when you left Nazi Germany together with your parents, how difficult was it to escape?
Sorry. There's something wrong with the technology here.
Okay, maybe
I'm not hearing.
that's okay. Maybe I'll ask that question again later. Let us go to our next speaker until that audio problem is resolved. And our next speaker is Professor KONRAD JARAUSCH. Professor JARAUSCH is also a very distinguished and long-serving member of the UNC History Department. For many years, he also was director of a contemporary history institute in Potsdam, near Berlin. KONRAD is an expert on German history regarding both the Nazi era and the year since 1945. He has written numerous outstanding books on German and European history, all worth reading. KONRAD JARAUSCH was born during the Second World War, but he never met his father, who was a German soldier deployed in Russia. 2 weeks after KONRAD's birth in Germany, his father died of typhus in Russia in January 1942. Today, Professor JARAUSCH will talk to us about how the German people coped with their defeat in the war and how they dealt with Allied occupation and reconstruction after the Second World War. Professor KONRAD JARAUSCH, please.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for your kind introduction. And what I have to say connects really quite well with what Gerhard has just told us. I do want to start also with personal involvement and a little bit historian and eyewitness, although the eyewitness part when you're 4 years old, when a big historic event occurs, is perhaps not quite as clear as what Gerhard experienced himself. The war ruined my family. As Klaus said, my father died in Russia in January 1942 while he was trying to help Russian POWs survive who were starved because the German Wehrmacht did not feed them and house them sufficiently. Among my uncles, one of them was a POW who came back to Bavaria only a couple of years after the end of the war. Suddenly he showed up in a rundown leftover uniform with a little wooden suitcase, and the other uncle, the brother of my mother, was for 2 years in an internment camp because he had been part of the military government in Belgium. The point that I'm trying to make with this is not superior insight, but rather that the Second World War left its traces immediately in my family. It destroyed my family, and therefore it's been a kind of challenge to think about why this outcome came about. Now let me make just 5 short points as well. The war experience on the German side was really different depending upon what demographic group one belonged to. There were 3 different wars. For the young men and even middle-aged men eventually, it was a matter of fighting in the military and being all over Europe and then being defeated. For the women, it was mostly the home front. Professor HAGEMANN will talk about that in a moment. And then, of course, the experience of the victims in the prisons, in the concentration camps, in the annihilation camps was horrible and not anything to be proud of. And that has left a kind of memory when the war changed from hooray, Germans are winning, to the war in Britain that is not won, and then the war in the Soviet Union, which is eventually even lost. Then you have a kind of changed character, which then makes Germans not in their own mind perpetrators, but rather in their own mind victims of the Allied invasion, of the bombing, and so on. And what then happens in 1945, when the war is over, a lot of people talk about a 0 hour. That is, they had to put their lives back together again their broken lives. I have a copy of my last book here, in which the 3 war chapters and the post-war chapter are rather central. I'll explain that in a moment. For the POWs, the men largely were in POW camps. Some countries released them relatively quickly. The French wanted German labor for a longer period of time, and the last surviving POWs out of the Soviet Union came back 10 years later. For the women, it was a special kind of so-called hour of the women, because they were the ones that kept their ancient parents and their children and their siblings together in a kind of situation which gave them, or which required them, to be much more active and decisive than a classic middle-class female role had been before. So this is the hour of the women. And of course, the victims, when they survived, were trying to not die after liberation. They were trying to get healthy again and figure out what to do with peace. So there was, and this is another point, a lot of discussion about the meaning of 1945, because men in the military mostly saw it as a military defeat. So the question is, what kind of memory of 1945 should there be in German society? And nationalists and conservatives still think of the end of the war as a defeat. Now, most of the civilians, and certainly 4-year-old children, were happy that the fighting was over and that they were still alive. So that is sort of the middle group. And the victims of the Third Reich, of the SS, in the prisons and in the camps and so on, they were happy to be liberated. And it took decades for public memory to shift from a feeling of defeat to a feeling of survival to a feeling of sympathy for the victims of the Third Reich that were liberated. The more lasting memory has to do with the learning process. Now, there's a lot of debate about how much the Germans did learn from the Second World War. Gerhard, I think, was very eloquent already in talking about the pacification. Even conservative nationalist Germans are clear in their own mind that World War III is not something that they should be planning and preparing for. And so there is this aspect of it. There is also the question, what kind of government system? The Weimar Republic had not been very successful at the end. It was a presidential quasi-dictatorship under Hindenburg. So relearning democracy is also something that happens as a result of the Second World War, because the defeat is so massive that it cannot be denied. And therefore, trying it once again is not really a serious option. And then there is the moral issue of how to confront the Holocaust. Does it get denied? There is a minority of right-wing people immediately after the war, post-Nazis, but by now, again, some of the skinheads and some of the AfD people that are denying the Holocaust. Fortunately, over several decades of soul-searching, of political statements, of media kind of reporting, of creation of Gedenkstätten, is a German word, memorial sites in the former camps, the majority of the public has come around to embracing human rights and to apologizing for what the German military and the SS had done. Now, one more point. In the whole perspective of the 20th century, the meaning of 1945 is what used to be called a turning point or a hinge. The first half of the 20th century is really bloody. It is a series of wars, depressions, and so on. And after 1945, fortunately, although a Cold War developed, this Cold War in Europe never became hot, and so we were all spared the Third World War. So the second part of the 20th century fortunately turned out to be somewhat more encouraging, and it is more encouraging because the lessons of the Second World War were learned by the German population. And sometimes I hope that a part of the American population for whom war is still something exciting and positive would have learned that lesson as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Konrad. Thank you very much for these also very eloquent remarks. Let me ask you, how close did Hitler actually come to winning the war? Was there something in that he was close to developing a nuclear bomb himself?
Well, I mean, you know, with the miracle weapons at the end, the Germans did develop rockets and the infamous V2s that they shot from northern France and Holland and Belgium to Britain. They had developed jet planes, jet fighter planes. The difficulty there was that half of the plane was in North Germany, the other half in South Germany, and the transportation system was so broken that they couldn't get together, and they had no jet fuel left at the end. And then, of course, there is still a debate among historians how close the Germans got to developing a dirty nuclear bomb. We can all be happy that this did not succeed. I don't think that the Germans, although the Wehrmacht was, you know, a bunch of well-trained soldiers, that in the long run, a war of attrition like the First World War was really unwinnable for the Germans because they did not have the raw materials, the resources, the size of population, and so on, in order to do that. As long as there were lightning wars, short wars against smaller single opponents, those could be won by the Germans. But I think the scholarship, Adam Tooze and others, is such that against Britain and Russia and the United States, even with Japanese help, this was basically unwinnable.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Karen Hagemann. And Professor Hagemann is a distinguished professor of history at UNC. Karen originally comes from Hamburg, not too far from Hanover, where Gerhard Weinberg was born. Karen Hagemann has held many outstanding fellowships and has written a tremendous number of well-regarded and well-known books on the 19th and 20th century. At present, she's working on the Oxford Handbook of Gender and War since 1600, and I'm pretty sure she's also busy with quite a few other projects dealing with gender and war. Today, she will talk about the social reordering that was caused by World War II and which led to a massive transformation of life and politics in the years after 1945. Professor Hagemann will give us a view of the developments on the ground and from the perspective of the ordinary people in war-torn Europe. Over to you, Karen.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for your kind introduction. I hope I can be heard. I'm struggling with allergies at the moment, which are very big in North Carolina. As a German and as one born in the 50s, of course, I could also tell from my perspective and the perspective of my families a different kind of story because I grew up in a family where both grandfathers were in the resistance, the fathers in the resistance. I have had members in concentration camps. So I grew up with a very different perspective than most Germans, and a very much anti-war and pacifist perspective. And that was actually one of the reasons why I at one point decided to work on the history of war and peace and war, military and civil society. And that's what I would like to contribute here today. And I will do this in 5 points. The first point is really, we have to look at the Second World War as a highly industrialized total war in which the borders between the so-called home front and the battlefront were completely blurred. The Second World War required much more than the first, an unprecedented involvement of citizens, of men, of women, of old and young, and especially women needed to replace the enlisted men in increasing numbers in all involved war powers in Europe. Not only in administrations, in agriculture and war industries, but also in war welfare and healthcare. But what is really new and different to the First World War, where this is only developed in small, very small numbers, is that women were also, which tend to be forgotten, involved in the service of the militaries in growing numbers during the war as nurses, as doctors, as auxiliaries, as soldiers and partisans. In addition, if we think about the special character of the Second World War, we have to be really aware that all the economies, but especially the German war economy, were also only able to continue with the exploitation of civilians and also prisoners of war in slave labor. Without the use of slave labor in Germany, the war economy couldn't have continued until the end of the war. To ensure this needed support of its own population, the different governments involved in the conflict passed conscription and labor laws, introduced wage and price control, rationed food and fuel, and used all kinds of media of war propaganda. And it is not, if we look at this in a comparative perspective, this was not very different in the main Allied powers in Britain, the United States, and Soviet Union than in the two Axis powers, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The other side of this important support of civilians and the population during the Second World War was, compared to the First World War, that the population, civilians, became much more than in ever earlier conflict a target of warfare by bombing, by economic blockades, by extreme exploitation, mass killings, and genocide. And here, something which we need to really think together is that the Holocaust and the Second World War cannot be separated. The extreme extermination, not only of Jewish people, but also of the Slavic population in the East, was part of Nazi Germany's imperial quest for Lebensraum in the East. And following from this kind of understanding as the Second World War as a highly industrialized total war, this had really far-reaching consequences for the post-war societies, their demobilization and the reordering of the societies. And here I will present my first slide. Share screen. What is really important if we think about the legacy of the Second World War, that these dimensions are very unseen and unheard of, even compared to the First World War. Cities and towns were in ruins, housing demolished everywhere, landscapes were devastated, industries and agriculture severely damaged. An estimated number of 22 million soldiers and 29 million civilians died. And of the latter, 11 million of different nationalities were murdered in prisons, concentration and extermination camps. 6 million of them, as I mentioned this before, were Jews. 35 million veterans came home mentally and physically disabled. And in addition, 18 million prisoners of war were really expected home and came home sooner or later. About 7 million displaced people were alone staying in Allied occupied Germany in 1945. In total, 4 million more were spared, it was distributed over Europe. And finally, although if we think about Germany, 12 million Germans had to fled or were expelled from East Central Europe into the Allied occupied Germany and Austria. What is important if we think about these numbers, and behind these numbers are really individual kind of fates, individual experience, collective experience, is that the devastating legacy of the Second World War on the European continent was quite unevenly distributed. Eastern Europe, and especially the Soviet Union, and I think you can see this on this graphic very clearly, had experienced a much higher death rate, not only in total numbers, but also compared to the size of population, which was of course related to this destructive policy quest of Nazi Germany for Lebensraum in the East. This went hand in hand with the level of death, destruction, and devastation in the East, which was unparalleled in the West. The unequal post-war situation in East and West Germany was made worse after the war, on the one hand, by the desperate demobilization policy of the Soviet Union on its allied countries, which appropriated everything economically viable, and on the other hand, by the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program of the United States for the Western Europe states in the East, which contributed greatly to this very different starting position after the Second World War. My third point is that when the war ended on the European continent with the defeat of Germany and its allies in May 1945, military, economic, social, and cultural demobilization and related restoration policies were crucial to address this kind of devastating and destructive legacy of World War I. Necessary was first and foremost a military demobilization of large numbers of soldiers and other military personnel, not so much in the occupied powers, but in the others, including a demobilization of medical staff and the organization of the return of the millions of prisoners of war. Economic demobilization included the dismissal of most of the, and I will stop the screen share here, the dismissal of most of the female workers in the war industries and the transition to a peacetime economy. And this brought also a revoking of wartime regulations, of production of labor, of rationing of goods, and price control, which in different countries extended into the post-war era on a different length of time. And one of the most important attempts was really to rebuild infrastructure and to construct destroyed houses. That was the largest housing crisis Europe ever has seen. And that's a really big difference if you talk comparatively to post-war Europe or post-war United States. And this devastation of housing was really shared in most countries. Social demobilization included the organization of the return of millions of displaced persons and refugees, which created an immense economic and social challenge for all post-war states and societies involved, and the immediate care for displaced and homeless, disabled veterans, war widows, and orphans. And finally, and I will only briefly mention this because Konrad Jarauscz and others talked about this, the main aim of cultural demobilization was the peaceful transition to societies, to peace, and the collective commemoration of war, the reconstruction of national war memories. And of course here, the difference between victory and defeat made an extremely important difference next to the political difference on one side or the other of the Iron Curtain. My last point is that of the important aim of both post-war social and cultural demobilizations in all European countries was the reconstruction of a pre-war social order by regendering the societies. Everywhere, and KONRAD talked about this already, families had lost relatives, were destroyed or hurt by war. And it became the task of the women to heal the wounds of war in the families everywhere in Europe. For post-war governments, it was important, therefore, to give the population, especially the returning soldiers, a feeling of the return to normality. And one of the central spaces to achieve this aim was the family. And therefore, the pre-war gender division of labor, and with it, the gender hierarchy between the sexes, which had been disordered during the war, needed to be restored again by labor, social, and family policies after the war. In the West, the ideal of the male breadwinner, female homemaker family informed post-war policies everywhere. This model, combined with consumerism, became during the 1950s Cold War one crucial marker of the West's difference from the communist societies in the East. The communist governments in the East, on the other side, used the socialist ideal and rhetoric of the emancipated working women and mother and the double earner family to emphasize the progressiveness of their system. Of course, we know that reality was a quite different story, and they only and mainly needed women as workers because there was a large surplus of women, especially in Eastern societies, because of the great losses. Both systems, likewise, and I have a problem, both systems likewise did not challenge the gender division of labor, and with it the hierarchies in politics, economy, and society in the family. And in the family, in the opposite, in both systems, in the East and in the West, this post-war policies and the legacy of the war had a long-lasting effect during the Cold War, and it contributed to the adherence of the gender hierarchical order in the East and the West. The result was that in the 1950s, in both Eastern and Western Europe, the 50s became the golden age of the nuclear family. So in a long-term perspective, as a women's and gender historian, you can argue that the way the war societies moved to peace and the importance of the gender order and the reordering of society based on a specific gender order had very long-lasting effects in really in strengthening old ideas in a new way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. This was most interesting indeed. Let me just ask you, you mentioned the occupation period between 1945 and 1949, which of course set important foundations for the future West Germany. How important was the re-education and denazification efforts by the Allied powers? Because we know, despite all denazification, there were still quite a few old Nazis left, both in business world, in the government, and elsewhere. But nevertheless, the West Germans developed a very democratic society, despite these former Nazis being left all over the place. How do you explain that?
That's a very interesting question. And of course, the attempts to democratize, denazify, demilitarize post-war Germany in the four Allied zones were differently developed. They were differently approached. And, but what we can really observe, especially if we look at the British and American zone, is that the more the Cold War developed, the less these attempts were implemented. Because what became very clear is, and that was the same in some ways in the Soviet occupied zone, is that you needed people who had experience in administration and laws and running businesses in the economy, who really contributed to this reconstruction, which I just urgent need of reconstruction. So what you can see if you look at the first 5-10 years, the number of people were they really implemented the top, but a lot of the ordinary Nazis were in the end whitewashed, as we say. They got a Passierschein, a whitewashing paper, as we said in Germany. And it is an interesting discussion if in some ways this approach in the long run helped to integrate this large group of supporters of the Nazis, of small perpetrators, not on a big scale, but on, on a small scale, on the everyday life scale, of bystanders into the West German society. And in some ways, you can argue that in the East, they did something similar, by really bringing the game, the responsibility, projecting it on the capitalists, on the West, on the fascists. This allowed in some ways too, and they did it, to include the ordinary Nazi members, supporters, bystanders into the society. And what is really interesting here, if I can come back to the gender dimension, is that, of course, because of this predominant ideas about the gender order, that men are the ones in politics, in charge for politics, economy, and war, women were for quite a long time constructed, even the German women, as victims of war. Yeah. So that this narrative helped to really redistribute guilt and responsibility, and helped really also the allies, interestingly, if you look at the material, helped also the allies to approach German women as the carriers of the future of Germany, the educators of the children, and the ones who can be re-educated, in a positive way, because they are not as involved in the Nazi system.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much indeed. We come to our next speaker, and our next speaker is Professor Joseph GLATTHAAR. He's a distinguished and long-serving professor of history at UNC. Joe GLATTHAAR is a military historian who above all focuses on American strategic and military history in the 19th and 20th century, and he has done also an awful lot of work on the Civil War. He's the author of numerous books and articles dealing with US military history. His latest book is a concise history of the American military. Today, Joe GLATTHAAR will talk to us about the United States and the Second World War, and why the US first hesitated to get involved in the war and was then the decisive power, together with the Red Army, for defeating Nazi Germany. Over to you, George.
Thank you, Klaus. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to point out before I get started that I am Gerhard Weinberg's professional grandson. He was the advisor to my advisor, so I have a great legacy in this group. I'm also, I think, the only one with a German last name who doesn't speak German.
This is true.
So you'll have to forgive me. We all have our faults, right? Okay, let me get started. As Klaus said, the United States was reluctant to get into World War II. The American economy was in bad shape. There was a strong anti-foreign sentiment that actually existed before World War I, but really took hold in the 1920s and retained its strength in much of the 1930s. Up until in the 1930s, we passed legislation which dealt with neutrality and tried to avoid or ensure that the United States avoided getting entangled in foreign wars, largely through the Neutrality Acts. Of course, Pearl Harbor changed everything. It galvanized the war for the American people. It brought them into it in a great way. And during World War II, the United States had an enormous advantage over everyone else in the sense that we had fighting in Hawaii, we had fighting in Alaska, but essentially, other than some German harassment of oil tankers and things like that along the eastern coast and a tiny bit on the western coast, the United States was completely untouched. At least the 48 continental states were completely untouched in the war. This enabled the United States to mobilize to an extraordinary degree. So in 1945, the United States had about 13 million people in uniform, which is a pretty substantial number when you consider the population was 150 million. And in fact, throughout the course of the war, we had about 16 million who served. So a lot of Americans served. We also were an economic juggernaut. Richard Overy writes in his book that the United States sent the Soviet Union so much food that it was enough to feed every single Soviet soldier all their meals for the entire war. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or not, but Overy's a fine historian, so I suspect there's some truth. But the truth of the matter is, programs like Lend-Lease were absolutely staggering. Let me give you an idea. These are goods that the United States produced, and as Robert Taft said, Lend-Lease is like bubble gum. Once you give it out, you really don't want it back. So we are giving this technology out to our allies. And this is just what the Soviet Union got in one fiscal year. And this is just military items. 5,000 aircraft, 20,000 jeeps, 3,000 artillery prime movers, 2,000 medium tanks, 132,000 trucks, 10,000 railroad flat cars, 500 locomotives, and 100,000 field telephones. That's just one fiscal year. And by the time of VE Day, May 1945, the United States had already sent 95% of what it had intended to allocate to the Soviet Union for that entire fiscal year. So the United States was well in advance of that. And American economy was just incredible what it produced during the course of the war. To put it in some small perspective, the United States built 100 aircraft carriers, 1,500 naval warships, 6,000 huge commercial ships, 300,000 aircraft, 630,000 jeeps, 88,000 tanks, 6.5 million rifles, 40 billion ammunition rounds, 437 million tons of steel, and 2 atomic bombs. The American economy was in bad shape when the war started. In 1939, we had an unemployment rate of 17.2%. In 1941, it was down to 9.9%, but the war transformed that. The war created 17 million new jobs in addition to the 13 million individuals who were in military service. So the war couldn't have come at a better time for the American economy. And so people suddenly had jobs and everything was kicking along. The United States, of course, fought in both theaters of the war, the European theater and the Pacific. So it was a pretty big strain, especially logistically, but in other ways as well. 407,000 Americans lost their lives in the war. Another 670,000 were wounded. The cost of the war to the United States in the contemporary dollars, not today's contemporary, I mean 1940s dollars, $304 billion. So the United States financed an enormous amount of the war. And the truth of the matter is that our allies were largely mechanized because the United States was able to provide them with sufficient mechanization that they were able to focus on very specific things. And Germany in World War II was still a predominantly horse-drawn army. So you see the advantages of American industrialization. Of course, one of the big problems the United States had was the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, died on April 12, 1945. His vice president was Harry S. Truman. Truman had just become vice president and really was not well informed about what was going on. So, for example, Truman did not hear of the Manhattan Project, the project to develop atomic bombs, until he became president of the United States, which puts things in a little different perspective. Truman wasn't particularly prepared to step in. And of course, when victory occurred in Europe, the United States was still heavily entangled in war in the Pacific. We're only halfway through our single largest battle in the Pacific theater, the Battle of Okinawa. Battle of Okinawa went on for another month and a half. So and it was really tough fighting. So we had a long way to go with regard to that. There were a number of issues that the United States had to wrestle with, but there was some certain advantage which ultimately proved to be a burden. The United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful country in the world. We had a domestic front that was largely undamaged by the war. We had a really large and powerful military, and we had the atomic bombs. The problem we had was we had difficulties trying to come to grips with the limits of our own power. And so throughout the time period, That's not me, folks. Throughout this time period, literally from World War II to the present day, we've still wrestled with this vital issue of what are the limits of power. Truman administration confronted a couple of other things. First of all, there was fear of lapsing back into the Great Depression. When you bring all these soldiers back home, how are we going to get them jobs? How are we going to keep them off the job market, at least temporarily? And of course, the US government developed some really amazing programs, specifically the GI Bill of Rights, which I assume Gerhard exploited. I know my father did. He was a Marine in the Pacific and he came home. His dad was a janitor. My dad got to go to college because he had the GI Bill, and it literally transformed my family because of that very thing. So the GI Bill provided housing, low interest housing loans for Americans, low interest loans to start businesses, paid for schooling, also gave you a stipend so that you didn't have to work when you went to school. The intention was to keep many of these workers off the job market so we could make that transition from wartime to peacetime. But still, people lived in great fear that the economy would collapse into the Great Depression. A second fear that we had was that communism was going to take hold. Obviously, Europe was in bad shape, and the communist parties in various European countries had gained strength, and it was perfectly comprehensible because of the wholesale poverty that existed in Europe in the aftermath of World War II. President Harry Truman carried on policies that were very much in line with American policies literally since the late 19th centuries. In the late 19th century, we began to adopt economic policies in foreign affairs, which would create level playing fields because American industry and American agriculture was so productive that we felt like we would be able to outcompete anybody on a level playing field. So we were always trying to open markets for American products. We obviously got defensive during the Great Depression when unemployment began to fall, but in the aftermath of that, actually in the Atlantic Charter, which was signed by Roosevelt and Churchill before Pearl Harbor, the United States again made a commitment to free trade. So we wanted that free trade. We saw Europe as an essential component of that free trade, and ultimately we had to come around and begin pouring resources into Europe to help get Europe back on its feet. So we have those long-standing economic policies. Of course, we also began to confront the expansion of China, expansion of communism. China, obviously, in the Pacific theater, but in the European theater, the Soviet Union ultimately refused to hold free elections in Poland. Soviets felt that they couldn't have a government that was not friendly to it on its western borders, and as a result, they made sure that pro-communist forces were elected, and then shortly thereafter, Eastern Europe fell to communism, and that created some tremendous strains. Truman had a bad reputation with communists. That didn't help matters. He said on the floor of the United States House that or actually United States Senate, that the United States should support either the Nazis or the Soviets, whichever side was losing, in hopes that they would kill each other off. And then a few years later, that guy was president of the United States. So you can imagine how much distrust that sowed with these individuals. So that's about it. I'll turn it over to others. And the United States, of course, quickly became kind of the bulwark with regard to limiting the expansion of communism, and largely because Americans were terrified at the notion that communism would undercut American capitalism, American capitalist objectives, and the expansion of the American economy. Klaus?
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Very much appreciated. Let me just quickly ask you about the role of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt. He had a very a strange relationship with both Churchill and even more so with Stalin. Can you throw some light on that? What do we make of that? Was he soft and taken in by Stalin, or is that all a rumor?
That's an interesting question. FDR was a very affable human being, and he liked to be liked, and he was very personable, and I think he found that he could kid around with Churchill and things like that. But I think, I think FDR had a good feeling for human beings and human suffering, but I don't think he was the intellectual that maybe you would want. You know, his policies oftentimes counteracted one another. He wasn't as decisive as he needed to be. Sometimes George Marshall would refuse to leave his office until Roosevelt signed a document because they needed information to get out right away. They needed to get the ball rolling right away. And Roosevelt was much more of a procrastinator. My suspicion is that with regard to Stalin, they probably had a little more, or I should say Roosevelt probably had a better sense of what Stalin's problems were than he led on to others, and that Truman, and of course Truman had no idea. So you get a sense that FDR had understood that Stalin really couldn't allow free elections in Poland. Now FDR couldn't support that because there's a huge number of Polish Americans, and they weren't going to tolerate that kind of thing. But you get the sense that Stalin intimated this to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt understood. So I think Stalin and Roosevelt probably had a little better rapport. And of course, Roosevelt had great hopes that in the aftermath of the war, those two countries would have great relations. Of course, Roosevelt was dead, never saw the outcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joe. Much appreciated. And last but not least, our speaker is Professor Jeffrey Jones, who will talk about the Soviet Union and World War II. Jeff is a professor of history at UNC Greensboro, that is some 50 miles from Chapel Hill. Jeff Jones's latest book focuses on everyday life and the reconstruction of the Soviet Union during and after the Great Patriotic War, as World War II was called in Stalin's Soviet Union. Thus, Jeff is an expert on Soviet and Russian history, and he will talk to us today about Stalin and Hitler, the USSR and the Second World War, and the difficult reconstruction of the Soviet Union after the end of the war. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I appreciate it. The Soviet trajectory to war and its role therein, which I'll discuss a bit at the outset today, was unique for several reasons, but I want to focus primarily on some of the key aspects of the Soviet post-war reconstruction because that is the topic of my own research. But I want to start 1930s. Throughout much of the 1930s, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin unsuccessfully sought an anti-Hitler alliance with France and the UK. So you can imagine his horror when he felt terribly betrayed when in October of 1938, of course, we get the Munich Pact, when the UK and France sat down with Hitler and signed the agreement that, the infamous appeasement, Neville Chamberlain basically handing over the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia to Hitler. Stalin's response to that was to turn the tables, so to speak, and seek peace, his own separate peace with Hitler, hoping thereby, actually, as Gerhard Weinberg discusses in his book, A World at Arms, hoping that the war would then unfold in a similar pattern to World War I, with a bloodbath and stalemate on the Western Front, and the Germans and the Western Allies would kill each other while the Soviets set it out on the sidelines. That was the idea, that was the motivation behind Stalin then pursuing, of course, the Nazi Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which they signed in August of 1939. That clears the way, of course, for Hitler then to invade Poland, September 1st, 1939, thereby beginning World War II. And Hitler, that is, doesn't have to worry about a two-front war because the Soviets at that point are setting it out. Of course, obviously, Hitler does not hold to the non-aggression pact, and he invades the Soviet Union in June of 1941, thereby forcing the Soviets into the war in a, shall we say, tense, hesitant alliance with the Western Allies. Really, at that time, initially, it was mainly just the British, the French underground, I guess you could say. But then, of course, a bit later, after Pearl Harbor in December of 41, the U.S. is brought into that alliance as well. As far as the impact of the war on the Soviet Union, and a couple of people have alluded to this already. Karen mentioned some of the casualty figures. I mean, it's unimaginable, really. It's difficult to fathom the devastation, the loss of lives. The estimate range of Soviet casualties is between 26 and 37 million. There's various ways of adding that up, and so it's a wide range, but a whole lot of people died. By far, and you saw it on the graph that was put up, by far the largest number of any combatant country, the largest number of casualties. And along with that, again, in contrast to what Joseph was saying, and the US was not severely damaged by the war, the Soviet Union was absolutely destroyed. That's putting it mildly. The infrastructure of the country that had taken years to, the industry, the travel, communication, transportation, et cetera, was just absolutely, it's in rubbles at the end of the war. The housing, as was mentioned, Soviet Union was absolutely devastated. Really got to emphasize that. So you can imagine, of course, at the end of the war, this terrible 4-year conflict, the tremendous sacrifice involved for Soviet citizens. Victory in May of 1945 is the most important event of Soviet history by far. It really replaces the 1917 revolution and the civil war that followed it as the defining moment of the Soviet narrative, of the existence of the Soviet Union, and has really in many ways remained that way. I actually, by the way, happened to be in Russia in May of 1995 for the 50th anniversary of the victory celebrations of World War II. And they said at that time that these were going to be the final mass celebrations, but that did not prove to be the case. As like spontaneously from below, in the following years, people continued to come out and celebrate. And now, of course, in recent years, Putin has really embraced that, and the celebrations are larger than ever. So the war, in short, is really the defining event of Soviet history, and to a significant degree, I would say, post-Soviet Russian history as well. My own research picks up with the end of the war and post-war reconstruction as I look at it, you know, how they put the pieces back together again, so to speak. My book is a local study of Rostov-on-the-Don, which is a city in southern Russia. But the issues that I focus on, I use, by the way, primarily party sources, archival party sources from Rostov. And the issues that I'll highlight here were really relevant to obviously all of the USSR, and to some degree, as has already been touched on by a couple of people also, throughout the countries of Europe and Asia impacted by the war. So I'd like to focus then on that and highlight some of these key issues facing Soviet Russia during the post-war reconstruction period for the remainder of my talk. The first is probably a fairly obvious one, which is just extreme poverty and deprivation, unimaginable really. There was in fact a terrible famine that struck the Soviet Union in 1946, 1947, an estimated 2 million deaths as a result of the famine. People at the time that as part of my research, I did a lot of oral interviews, and quite a few people were telling me, you know, yeah, the war was terrible, it was horrible, but the worst part was after the war when we had to live through this famine and we just never had enough to eat. It was very, very devastating. Karen Hagemann had mentioned the housing issue. That was profoundly important. Housing was in extremely short supply in post-Soviet Russia. For that matter, it already had been even before the war, because there's a rapid urban migration throughout much of the 1930s. And then you add to that, of course, the destruction of the war. In the case of Rostov, an estimated 75% of the city's housing is destroyed or severely damaged during the bombing, during the war. Just to give you some idea, people lived in dugout bunkers, hallways, severely damaged buildings. I remember reading about one scientist who worked in the morgue and actually also lived and slept there because he didn't have anywhere else to go, just to give you some idea here. Politically, by far, and it's something that we haven't touched on yet, but by far the biggest political challenge facing the Stalinist regime following the war was the issue of collaboration. how do you deal with people who in one way or another had cooperated with or worked with the Germans during what, in the case of Rostov, was about a 6-month period of their occupation of the city from June of 1942 to February of 1943. Not surprisingly, of course, the Stalinist regime cracked down very harshly on the most egregious, the most blatant instances and cases of collaboration. But the problem was, you know, it's a rather vague concept. What exactly constitutes collaboration? How do you define that notion? There's a lot of gray area in there. Let's put it that way. And the thing that I found in looking at Rostov is at the local level, a lot of the authorities were surprisingly lenient, except for the worst cases, obviously, but very lenient in a lot of cases, primarily because they faced such a severe shortage of labor power during the post-war Reconstruction period that they needed, especially skilled labor, they needed workers. So they were willing to overlook some of these issues of collaboration, at least to some extent. Another major problem for Russia, Rostov during this period was street crime. It was a huge problem in this period. There was, you know, countless anecdotal examples I could give you. I remember there was a story about a musician, sort of a local celebrity, a musician who died in 1946. And the day after his funeral, they found that someone had dug up his coffin, dumped his body out, and stole the clothes that he was buried in, presumably to sell those then on the local black market. There was an organized crime syndicate organization operating in Rostov and elsewhere called Black Cat. There were local party reports that workers in the winter, when it gets dark earlier, of course, workers would bring mats to the factory and they would just lay their mats out and sleep there on the factory floors because they were afraid of walking home in the dark because crime was so prominent during the winter months there. Another huge issue, rampant corruption, very much an issue here. I remember one of the key sources that I relied upon were informant reports, what NKVD, or now subsequently known as KGB agents, were overhearing people saying. And one such report was of a worker saying, and I quote, "Right now you can't get anything done without a bribe. Everyone knows it, but you can't do anything about it." Kind of sums it up perfectly. Bribes, payoff, corruption of all sorts was just pervasive throughout this period, an essential part of post-war late Stalinist life. And then a related issue to that is the issue of speculation, very Soviet concept here. Speculation meaning simply the buying and selling of goods for profit, which was also extremely prominent as part of a thriving, illegal, underground market economy during the war years and after, at least up until 1948. Really, the government didn't even try to repress this illegal economy because people were so dependent upon it for the sake of survival. To do so would have been extremely detrimental. And by the way, this issue of speculation was very closely linked to the issue of rampant corruption, because a lot of the key figures who were benefiting from the illegal market were local party leaders who were in cahoots with the market mechanism and profiting from it very much. The Stalinist regime does try to clamp down on the market economy a bit in 1948, but only with some degree of success, and it remains an issue certainly, but it was very prominent through the war years up until 48, to put it mildly. And then finally, the last feature that I would highlight, which stands out in this period as well, is worker opposition to state policies. Not something we tend to associate with an allegedly totalitarian Stalinist system. There were countless small-scale strikes. There were walkouts and slowdowns at work, mostly very small-scale, individualized, not unified, not organized, but very widespread nonetheless. And sort of a related issue to that, which was extremely common, was workplace theft or pilfering. People were stealing what they could. I remember interviewing one former worker of a factory who told me that at the factory that he worked at, the workers stole, quote, everything that was not locked down. This was one of the ways they would steal materials and then sell it on the black market themselves. This was one of the ways that workers, strategy of survival in a very, very, very difficult time and amid tremendous hardship. So in conclusion, I just want to stress again that many of these issues were prevalent to varying degrees, not just in Rostov at this micro level, throughout the Soviet Union at the national level, but really a lot of these issues, and they come up in various ways here, were relevant throughout the combatant nations of World War II and for the years of the post-war period as well. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. We come to the questions in a minute. That was very interesting indeed. In March 1953, Stalin suddenly died. And you would imagine that everyone was relieved to get rid of the dictator. Instead, people were genuinely sad, and there was a lot of crying, a lot of mourning going on, even in the gulags, in the prison camps in the Soviet Union. How do you explain that? Because everyone also had suffered under Stalin, hadn't they?
Yeah, yeah. And there were, to be clear, some people who were relieved and kind of secretly celebrating. But you're right, I think on a mass level, the vast majority of people were not happy to see this. There's various ways, actually his funeral, over 1,000 people were stampeded, crushed to death at his funeral. His things got out of control. And it was, and people were very mournful on the whole.
No social distancing at the time.
No social distancing at all. Right? And it is hard to explain. I think one way of thinking about it, I've had people tell me this as well in interviews and otherwise, especially for a younger generation, not just, but especially for the younger generation, they grew up with this image of Stalin was an infallible God. He simply could do no wrong. And part of that, as one woman I interviewed explained to me, when she was growing up in the 20s and especially the 30s, her parents might have been quietly critical on the side of Stalin, like, oh yeah, he had repressed one of their uncles, for example, but they would never say that loudly in front of her as a child for fear that she might go to school and say, oh, Stalin, my parents said Stalin was a brutal dictator, which is not something you wanted your kid to say, right? So these kids grew up with this very deified image of Stalin that was unchallenged, even by their own parental authorities, until, if at all, really not until the Khrushchev period, right? When secret speech and some of the criticism. So I think that in part explains it. He was such a central part of he was the new czar, in effect, such a central part of the Soviet system that, his death was nonetheless mournful for many.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Mm-hmm. Let me briefly say something about Britain and the Second World War and the consequences for the UK. And after that, I would suggest we open it up to questions from the audience. Let me make 3 points. The role of Churchill, firstly. Every year, plenty of books are still being published on Churchill. And Churchill, of course, before the Second World War, was the most controversial politician. And some of these books, which are still being published, are quite hagiographic, and some are very hostile. Still, there's a consensus, I believe, that Churchill was highly relevant for Britain's war effort, in particular regarding May 1940, when the country was fighting alone. It is true that Churchill wavered briefly whether or not to join Chamberlain and Halifax, who were still members of the war cabinet at that stage, and join them and seek peace with Hitler Germany by negotiations, for example. And of course, at that stage, Hitler was conquering all of Europe, and it looked as if he was winning the war and conquering Europe within a matter of weeks or months. Yet, in the last resort, Churchill didn't. Instead, he managed to save Britain's army from extinction by repatriating over 300,000 British soldiers from Dunkirk back to Britain in late May, early June 1940. And Churchill's immense rhetorical skills turned this military withdrawal into a huge victory, actually, a propaganda victory, certainly. Churchill's words certainly kept the country going and rallied it to narrowly continue the fight until eventually, in the course of 1942, a growing number of US forces came in. A Prime Minister Chamberlain or Prime Minister Halifax would not have been able to do this, I would say. And it is this, his action in May 1940 and his immense rhetoric, which turned him into the national and global icon and hero he has become in the meantime. Churchill, of course, still lost the British general election in July-August 1945, but that was mostly not due to his person. The British public had become very doubtful that Churchill's party, the Conservative Party, which had been in power one way or another since 1923, that party was identified with war and the military effort, and people were frankly fed up with war. The majority of the British voters also wondered whether the Conservatives, which at the time were still full of upper-class aristocrats, whether they would be the right party for the social demands and the reconstruction needs of the post-war period. Secondly, by the end of the war, Britain was bankrupt and the empire was in rapid dissolution. For the general public and the outside world, that only became clear a few years later, perhaps when India obtained independence in 1947. However, for Britain's political elite, certainly for those dealing with Britain's finances, this was pretty obvious already in 1945, if not earlier. On July 11, 1945, the top official at the Foreign Office, Sir Orme Sargent, submitted a top secret memorandum to new Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee entitled Stock Taking After VE Day. It was essentially a frank admission of the deplorable state of Britain's finances. And it was, as I said, top secret. Sargent told the Prime Minister that the country was totally bankrupt and the prospects of recovery looked dim. However, he believed if the UK put itself at the mercy of the United States and obtained generous loans and grants best and financial support from Washington, this dire period of time could be overcome in due course and Britain would be able to sit the problem out and remain a great power on the same level as the United States and the Soviet Union. This, however, proved to be a pipe dream, not least because the United States refused to provide the British with any free grants. With great difficulties, a big loan was arranged with the United States in December 1945, but not at zero interest rates as London had hoped. The US simply did not believe that Britain was as desperate as London said, and they were reluctant to support Britain as generously as was really required and necessary. This meant that in due course, Britain had to withdraw from most of its colonial possessions. So this process dragged on well into the 1960s, or if you like, until 1997, when Hong Kong was returned to China. Third, already in the stock-taking paper of 1945, Britain's dependency on the United States as a consequence of the Second World War had been made clear. It became even clearer in the Suez Crisis of 1956. This dependency on the United States has dominated post-war British foreign policy to this very day. In the Suez Crisis, the US refused to support the British and French attempts to reoccupy Egypt, and the European countries had to abort their invasion. While the French concluded from this humiliation that they had to build up their own power as an independent power, independent from the United States, as the US clearly was an unreliable ally. And we can say that this thinking has dominated French politics to this very day. The British concluded that without the United States, they could not maintain being a great global power. They concluded that Britain always had to be in sync with the United States and being seen as closely on the side of the United States. In the last resort, it were Britain's great efforts in World War II that had exhausted the country. In foreign policy and defense terms, it made the UK almost totally dependent on the United States. Thus, despite Churchill's heroic efforts and his iconic position, the impact of the Second World War on Britain has had a deep, deep impact to this very day. As you know, Prime Minister Johnson also tries to be as close as possible to the current, not uncontroversial American president. That is what I would like to say about the British and Churchill, and I've kept it brief in order to leave more time for questions. And we come to the question periods from our audience. And the way we go about this is that Will Yoder will select the questions and will also read them out, and I will then moderate the discussion with the speakers. Will, do you want to suggest the first question, please?
Yes, the first one that came in is from Gordon Galloway, who's a high school teacher in North Carolina, a history teacher. And he asks, to what extent did US political or military leaders know about the Holocaust in Nazi Germany prior to December of 1941? And
yep, sorry.
Likewise, what did the American public know about the Holocaust prior to American military involvement? And was there a concerted effort by leadership to keep the public in the dark about these atrocities?
Good question. I think that sounds like a question for Joe GLATTHAAR. What do you think?
Oh, he's muted.
Joe?
Trying to unmute him.
Yeah.
I think Gerhard is best suited to respond to this because I've heard him speak about it before.
Okay, do you want to give an answer yourself and then we go to Gerhard, or do you want to pass on?
I want to pass to Gerhard, then I'll respond to what he hasn't addressed because he's more knowledgeable.
Okay, Gerhard, would you like to come in and answer this question?
Well, the Allies, the Americans, like the British, knew a good deal in 1941 when the systematic killing started, but had doubts about what it could be done about it. There was a public declaration called the St. James Declaration because it was agreed to in the St. James Palace in London, denouncing this after a year or so that it was going on. But it seemed to the American leadership that the way to stop this was to defeat Germany just as quickly as possible. And at the same time, the American leadership was constrained by the legislation that the Congress had passed and the president, Calvin Coolidge, had pushed and signed in the early 20s. And under those circumstances, there was practically no way to let any substantial number of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust into the United States. There was one time during the whole war that the president decided to do something different. Under American rules, he could bring prisoners of war into the United States to be in camps here on the assumption that at the end of the war, they would be returned to whatever country they came from. The president in 1944 decided to try to utilize this device to bring, without immigration papers, on a temporary basis, just short of 1,000 refugees into this country and keep them until they could be returned to their home countries in a place in upstate New York, Oswego. And there was immediately the initiation of impeachment procedures in the United States Congress. And it was not, I would suggest, a coincidence that in the same days that the president and the White House announced there would be no further such actions, that the impeachment procedures were dropped. One has to see this in terms of what not the governments, but the mass of people were thinking at the time.
Thank you. And quickly, why did the United States not bomb the railway tracks to Auschwitz and other Holocaust camps?
The answer to that is that at the time that this was an issue, in the spring of 1944, the United States was insistent, along with Britain, that their air forces had to concentrate on the preparation for the D-Day landing. Keep in mind that the Germans occupied Hungary in March of 1944. So you have two things that interact in a way. The Allies are unwilling to divert air forces from other jobs in support of the forthcoming and then implemented invasion. The other side, as Yaron Pasha has shown in his book very clearly, the Germans could not utilize the same trains to take Jews from rural parts of Hungary to Auschwitz and simultaneously carry ammunition from German factories to their soldiers in France trying to crush the Allied D-Day invasion. One has to see these things in terms of the perceptions and priorities at the time. Hitler's and the German government's priority was the killing of Hungarian Jews. The Allied priority was to crush Germany as quickly as was at all possible.
Thank you very much. Joe, do you want to add to that?
No, Gerhard gives splendid answers.
Thank you. Bill, do you have another question for us?
Yes, we've got a good one from Stuart Kaplan. He asks, did Churchill favor an Allied invasion through Southern Europe rather than into Western France as a way of preempting Russian invasion of Germany? And would that have been logistically or strategically possible?
I guess I should answer that. I think Churchill was above all concerned with the Mediterranean as links to the empire. That was what he was mostly preoccupied with. We know that Stalin was very critical of Churchill for Churchill proposing that the Normandy invasion should take place not in 1942 or 1943, but only in 1944, as it did. And Stalin never believed that Churchill did that for geostrategic reasons, but he believed that Allied powers, particularly Britain, waited to let the Red Army do the fighting and also the killing, the dying, of course, and weakening it for the future. So Stalin was always most suspicious of Churchill's preference for a Mediterranean strategy. But this had all to do with Britain's geostrategic interest in the empire and keeping the empire links open. And also it is true that it is doubtful that without a large number of American troops, which by that stage had not arrived in Europe, that would have been successful. You know, Churchill also doubted that. Anyone else who would like to come in? Konrad, perhaps?
Of course, opposed Roosevelt and all his military advisors opposed Churchill's idea.
Yeah.
And if one looks at this in the long term, what it would have meant if Churchill's idea had been followed is that then the Iron Curtain, instead of going north-south from the Baltic to the Adriatic, would have gone east-west along the Pyrenees, Alps, and Carpathians, with the Soviets in control of all of Germany, the Low Countries, France, and Denmark, and the Western Allies would have perhaps had Albania and Bulgaria on their side of the Iron Curtain. I'm not so sure that we would have been better off with that arrangement.
Thank you.
Also, let me add that logistically, it would have been a nightmare going through that area. It's really rough terrain. It would have been very difficult to support large numbers of troops. It just wasn't a practical proposal. And then, of course, they ended up invading southern France, which Churchill opposed. And that's why they called it Operation Dragoon, because Churchill was dragooned into accepting the invasion of southern France.
And Churchill receives the iconic status he has at present, not because of his war strategic thinking, but because of holding on and his rhetoric and the May 1940 decision, I would say. His strategic thinking has always been in doubt, both during the Second World War as, of course, before, like Gallipoli during the First World War and other issues. But I think he probably would admit that himself to some extent.
The cliché has always been that it would be the soft underbelly of Europe. And I keep thinking of Churchill's soft underbelly rather than of Europe.
Thank you. Will, do we have another question?
Yeah, we do. We have an interesting one from Mike Bennett and Carrie about World War II and Holocaust education in Germany. He says that during a river cruise in 2017, he visited a huge exhibit at the Nuremberg parade grounds, and they were told that all or most German high school students were required to visit it. Is this true? And how and when did this come about? It sounds like a great educational idea. I have something to add to that before, actually. about 7 years ago, when I was in high school, we had 2 German exchange students, and we were taking AP European history. They were in the classes, and they had received no education about World War II or World War I, and they were juniors in high school, or the equivalent of juniors in high school, and I was shocked by that. So is that something that's changed in recent years?
Karen, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I can do, because actually I belong to the generation who were the first who got education in the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust, not because our high school teachers or professors, or some professors, the older professors, were really liking to do this, but I grew up as part of the second wave of student movement in the 1970s. I finished high school in the mid-1970s, so there was a lot of push from my generation to really challenge the older generation, talk about this, what did you do? So this question, what did you do in this period, was really one which we asked in class and at the university level. And this change, this move towards a kind of addressing the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust cannot separate it in Germany. It was one, it belonged together. And of course, there were other factors which were really in support of this move. The social change in general, the development of a student movement, the development of social movements, a whole kind of area of reform. So my first question in respect of your own experience would have been, from which region in Germany did the students come? Did they come from an urban, northwestern, or eastern, or Bavarian part? Because what, you know, of course, in general, this is part of the curriculums. And, you know, we were all, you know, all younger students are more or less forced, which is in some ways problematic, go to memorial sites, or go to Berlin, or go to Dachau, or Sachsenhausen, or one of the concentration camps, or Neuengamme. But the question that there are a lot of regional differences, of course, you know, so depending on where you go to school and how your teachers are trained, and if this is a more social democratic or was a more conservative controlled federal state, the way it is implied is very different. But I think in general, we, at least when I talk to my sons, you know, as long as they were in Germany, it was addressed so much, and they grew up in Berlin and Hamburg, that it was too much. So they couldn't really hear it any longer. They didn't want to hear it any longer. So it really depends on which generation you're talking about. In general, it started to change dramatically in the 1970s, but there are still developed regional differences, and the East-West divide is very crucial. In the East, they addressed it in a very different way. So, but I think Konrad wanted to already interrupt me. So Konrad, I give you the floor, and we can talk together about different generations.
I just wanted to say that I have a dissertation student who is defending her dissertation next week, which is on the rewriting of textbooks and the Holocaust and or resistance part in Italy, in East Germany, and in West Germany. And it's decade-long struggle. This does not come about overnight, but in comparison, the West Germans have done more than the Italians.
And you know, what I think, if I can add one thing, what for my generation at least was really important is that, yeah, it was a continuous struggle. It is still contested, but what it is very much part of everyday life culture. So for example, if you go to Berlin or Hamburg or other cities, you find everywhere this little, what we call Stolpersteine, stones, cobblestones, copperstones in the streets, in front of houses, in front of sites where Jewish people or other victims of the Holocaust live. And so this is really, it's much more integrated in everyday life memory than, you know, in several other German states. But of course, as the rise of anti-Semitism currently in Germany and other European states shows, this is a never-ending story. We have to continue to address this. We need to continue to talk about this, but we might think about different ways to approach this with new generations.
Thank you very much. Will, do we have some more questions?
Yes, we have one from Dick Cohn, and he's asking if the panel could address the importance of Allied code breaking on the victory over both Germany and Japan.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Who would like to go first? Joe, that sounds like you.
Allied code breaking proved to be exceedingly helpful, and there is an interesting aspect to it. Then and even after the war, most German military would not believe that the random electronic substitution codes, the Enigma, I'm speaking, we can talk about Japan if you want to in a moment, but they could not believe that since they had been unable to break into the British Typex or the American Sigabar, that is to say the electronic substitution codes that were being used by the British and the Americans, and that the Germans tried but couldn't break, that since they had not been able to do this, those morons on the other side could not possibly have done anything of that sort. But the reality, of course, was that they did. And the best Polish joke of the 20th century, of course, was that the initiative of success in breaking the Enigma was Polish. And Poland shared this information with the British and French in the summer of 1939. And there's no question that this assisted the Allies substantially.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to come in?
Yeah, I'll pipe in for just a bit. Of course, the Americans had broken the Japanese code, and the advantage that we had in the Pacific was that the communications were largely through radio transmissions, so that anyone could intercept them. One of the big problems we had once we began fighting on continental Europe is that the Germans communicated by telephone, and unless you can tap the telephone line, you can't get the information. So that's why we were caught so flat-footed with the Battle of the Bulge, because we didn't anticipate the offensive in the Ardennes, whereas in the Pacific theater, it's a huge, huge advantage. I mean, you look at the major naval engagements early in the war, Coral Sea, Midway, both of those are tremendously reliant on intercepted and decoded Japanese transmissions. Of course, it also leads to the big debate about whether we knew about Pearl Harbor or not. And that's a really interesting issue because, of course, the Japanese never really say that they're going to attack Pearl Harbor. They say a big event is going to come, and the United States forecast it correctly. That is, that they were going to invade the Philippines to nullify the forces there, and then push into the Dutch East Indies so they could get access to oil. And that the attack on Pearl Harbor was merely to crush the American fleet so that the Americans couldn't interfere with their ability to draw oil from the Dutch East Indies. And so we predicted correctly about a major event. We just didn't have all the targets in play. It's just one of those situations. You know, intelligence is unbelievably valuable, and whether you're talking about ultra or magic, they were priceless resources for the Allies, but they don't always tell you everything.
What about the conspiracy theory that Churchill knew about Pearl Harbor and he didn't say anything to get the US and Franklin Roosevelt into the war?
I don't think there's anything to it. There's a top secret memo of Churchill to the War Cabinet right after he came back from Newfoundland. And he made it clear that Roosevelt was going to look for an incident to get the United States into war, that we were going to fire on German warships in the Atlantic, and we were going to convoy supplies across. And if the Germans attacked Americans, then that would provoke a war. And if they didn't, that would be tantamount to ultimately winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Roosevelt also made it clear that if he asked Congress to declare war, they would debate it for months and they might not even decide to go to war, and that the American people were clearly opposed to getting into the war at that time. So I don't think that it wasn't going to work. I mean, I just don't see that as being truthful. You would never risk having your Pacific fleet destroyed. And remember, we were fortunate that our aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor. We had 2 aircraft carriers that were delayed in heavy seas, and as a result, they didn't arrive at Pearl Harbor. You would never risk your aircraft carriers like that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very convincing. Will, do you want to ask, do you have some more questions?
Yeah, we have plenty of more questions. This one's from Julia Kauto, who's a history and Russian student at the University of Birmingham. She wants to know how the Soviet Union was able to keep up its image as such a strong superpower, even though it was fighting with famine and poverty as huge issues across the country.
Jeff, that seems to be a question for you.
Yeah, and it's a very, very good question. They really projected a false image. I mean, they were, on the one hand, they were one of the major two victorious powers over Nazi Germany. Yes, but on the other hand, and Joseph touched on this as well, in contrast, the U.S. was not greatly devastated by the war. The Soviet Union, as I noted, was severely devastated, but they projected an image of strength, and probably most importantly, they continued to occupy the countries of Eastern Europe that they had, quote unquote, liberated from Nazi occupation, per what Gerhard was mentioning as well. They boots on the ground throughout Eastern Europe, which allowed them to extend these communist regimes into that area. And also they greatly downplayed the impact of the war. Stalin gave a speech not long after the war in which he said the Soviet Union had lost 7 million people. And of course, nobody knew for sure at that time what the numbers were, and that was a gross underestimation. He knew it was an underestimation, but he feared that getting anywhere near the truth on that would reflect weakness, and he clearly does not want to do that. So I think it's, there's several factors. Despite their, the idea of them being a superpower is grossly exaggerated because they are very, very devastated. But at the same time, they're occupying Eastern Europe, they're projecting an image of strength, and they're downplaying the impact of the war. I think all of those factors play into it.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me just say that we are already over time, but there are so many questions which people have asked. So if the speakers are agreeable, I would say we take quite a few more questions and continue to go over time, if that is okay with everyone. Will,
do you mind if I pose a question to Lloyd? My question is, how did textbooks portray World War II in France?
Good question. Lloyd.
This is a very interesting problem. It gets back to the question of historical memory that we were talking about in relation to Germany. Of course, in the early decades after the war, part of de Gaulle's attempt to reconstruct a strong sense of national coherence was to argue that we all were united in some way to oppose the German occupation. And there was a radical downplaying of the French role in collaboration in rounding up Jewish French citizens and collaborating in sending Jews to camps. All of that was more or less effaced from historical memory in the first 2 or 3 decades after the Second World War. It was really the movie The Sorrow and the Pity with Marcel Ophuls, which came out in the early 70s, I think, that began to generate a new discussion about collaboration. And then the work of American historians like Robert Paxton, which called attention to how many people in the Vichy regime and in other parts of France had collaborated actively in helping the Germans carry out the Holocaust. And only recently have there been museums created in Paris, for example, and in Drancy, which is was a collection center. But the textbooks themselves have been slow to catch up, and only recently have they recognized this history.
Well, thank you
very much. Thank you. Bill.
So Tracy Spa, a UNC student in Boonville, North Carolina, has asked a question that I think can be applied to the UK, Germany, and France in this discussion. She asks, what impact did the Second World War have on the development of European welfare states?
Could I jump in on that very quickly?
Yeah.
I would stress two factors. One was that many European elites were very aware of how poverty and economic dislocation had contributed to the rise of extremism. So the sense of a strong social welfare net was very important. And also in places like France, the right-wing parties that would have historically opposed such reforms were so discredited by the collaboration that for a period of time, they didn't really play an active role in the governments, and therefore it was possible to institute welfare state reforms much more rapidly than would have happened otherwise.
Should I respond first and then Klaus, or vice versa?
No, you go ahead. Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I would actually argue, starting up from my brief thesis or in presentation, that the devastation of the war in some ways really created the need to build up welfare states or strengthen existing welfare states in most European countries in different ways. And of course, yes, the lesson from the First World War played an important role far beyond Europe, because the war didn't end in 1918. There was civil war in the East. There were revolutions and conflicts, paramilitary upheavals in a lot of European countries. And so if this was supposed to be prevented, if the reconstruction needed to be addressed successfully, one needed a strong state. One needed a strong welfare state. And that is actually my argument. Part of this welfare state reconstruction of the general economic and social reconstruction was a gendering of societies. And the interesting point is that, of course, in some ways, both sides, the East and the West, in the context of the Cold War, needed to build up welfare states in different ways with a different focus. But in some ways, they share some which were a long time overlooked during the Cold War common threads. But I think KONRAD and KLAUS can address to this, and now we can, see more in a comparative way.
If I can come in for just a second, I was a beneficiary of the post-war welfare state. My mother was a war widow, and she only gradually got back into teaching, which she had lost in the Third Reich. So the meager pensions and the child support money helped put me through school in the 1950s. So it's the human detritus left over by the war, the refugees, the people who had lost their homes through bombing, the people whose husbands had died or had been in POWs and so on, the refugees, 10, 12 million from Eastern Europe that needed to be integrated and so on. There were so many huge challenges that it became something that was not a single party issue, only Social Democrats, but Christian Democrats also understood. And the equalization of burden law in the 1950s is a kind of government attempt to redistribute wealth from those people who got through the war reasonably well to those people who in one way or other ended up suffering more than the average.
And you can add, if you compare the United States and Germany after 1945, that this collective experience of the need of a strong welfare state for the reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, is really an important difference, which we really share as Europeans, and which the United States doesn't have in the same way, because the level of destruction, the level of death toll was far lower and very much different.
Yeah, regarding Britain, of course, the welfare state was essential as an outcome of the Second World War. Well, there had been, and there was some good progressive thinking among the Conservative Party as well. Just think of the Beveridge Report, for example. But it was clear that most thinking was done within the ranks of the Labour Party and affiliated organizations. And the Second World War, above all, made Labour ministers credible. Until then, there had only been one Labour Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, in the early 1930s, and he had been head of a national government. It hadn't actually been a pure Labour government. And the Labour Party and the potential Labour government was seen as still dubious, as socialistic, as irresponsible before the beginning of the Second World War. And then Churchill gave all the domestic ministries to Labour ministers. So the Labour ministers were in charge of running the industry of Britain, of running the food deliveries, of running the health system, also domestic industries. And they did that rather well. And by the end of the war, Labour had been an accepted political force. They were not seen as extreme anymore or irresponsible or incompetent, but quite the opposite. And then the Conservatives, as I said in my little talk, the Conservatives were identified with A, aristocracy, which and the upper classes in society, and B, with the war effort and great military endeavors, while Labour was identified with social policy, with social thinking, and they had done a good job in the course of the Second World War in charge of these domestic ministries. So in a way, it was hardly surprising that people overwhelmingly in Britain in 1945 voted for the Labour Party rather than for the ruling, so to speak, or the majority ruling governing Conservative Party. And Churchill was the exception here. If he had personally stood alone without being affiliated to the Conservative Party, he would have clearly won an overwhelming victory. And he was returned in a landslide himself in his own constituency. But Churchill alone wasn't sufficient for the Conservative Party to win the election. And it is said that actually many soldiers in the field, soldiers who were based in Germany and elsewhere in the empire who voted by postal vote, that they overwhelmingly voted for the Labour Party. Not least because they wanted to come home. They were fed up with the military effort. And that, I think, apart from these domestic social considerations, was another important way which influenced the British voter, that one had to go back to normalcy, away from war and the war effort. And the party which seemed to represent that was the Labour Party. And the Labour Party, of course, had that huge program of establishing a welfare state and the National Health Service, for example, in Britain. And that was what was done in 1945 by Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee. And to this very day, Clement Attlee and the Labour government of between 1945 and 1951 is probably regarded as the best post-war British government there is. And even today, Prime Minister Johnson does not dare to touch the National Health Service, quite the opposite, because it has become a holy cow, which is totally untouchable. And that goes back to the Labour government. And more importantly, it goes back to what happened in the course of the Second World War and the changes and transformations of society and the changes in thinking of the British people. And that has lasted to this very day, I would say. Will, do we have some more questions?
Yes, we do. This one is probably best for Professor Hagemann. It's from T. Yuan. And they're asking about the treatment of women by the Soviet Army, or specifically German women by the Soviet Army in the invasion and occupation of Berlin. And they mention reading the book Berlin, the Downfall, 1945 by Anthony Beaver, and the fact that the book's controversial. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I can. Of course, sexual violence is part of warfare and also of occupation. And there is absolutely no doubt that Soviet soldiers raped German women. It's hard to tell how many, the estimates are around 2 million, less or more. But what I would like to emphasize is that sexual violence was practiced in different forms, starting from rape, mass rape, individual rape, forced prostitution, to more different forms of sexual violence, like selling your own body because you have to survive, or you don't want to go to a prison. Is this violence? Is this not? So there is a continuum of practices of sexual violence in warfare in Europe, which we can see and know about. And these forms of sexual violence, not forced prostitution, but rape, is also practiced, and there are new studies on France and on the Americans and other occupying forces, which show that these armies too, they raped. So they raped during the Second World War, not in the same extent. There is a lot of research in last years about the experience of the women and how they really remembered it. It was for these women, obviously, for a lot of women, very, very hard to deal with this. And they didn't really often find a space, a possibility to talk about this. If French women were raped by German soldiers, there was, or had relations with German soldiers, there was in the post-war period this suspicion of collaboration. They were the scapegoat of collaboration very often. They were actually shown in the cities, which I forgot the English word, but with the shaved hats, they were really representing collaboration. And in Germany, of course, the rhetoric before the war, before the end of the war by the Nazis was, if we don't protect our women, they will be raped by the Soviet soldiers, and they build up this rhetoric in the propaganda. So yes, this is part of warfare. It was for a long time not addressed by historians. It's only changed since the 1990s, but there is an increasing number of studies about this.
Thank you. Perhaps Konrad and Lloyd would like to come in onto that as well.
Klaus, I would like to address that one if I may.
Absolutely, please.
Because there's actually a book that I would strongly recommend if the person is interested in this topic is Catherine Meredell's called Yvonne's War, about the experience of Russian Soviet soldiers during World War II. And this is one of the key topics she addresses. Soviet soldiers very much, to put things in context, by the way, obviously not justifying in any sense whatsoever, saw this as vengeance. Yes. Because German troops had definitely carried out mass rapes on a very regular basis in their occupation of the Soviet areas as well. They saw it in this term, and in fact were all but ordered to carry out rapes up until a certain point. And this is one of the things that Catherine Meredell shows in her work. And aside from that book, which I think is particularly good, there's a German book that's turned into a film called A Woman in Berlin. And then there's a recent, I think maybe 2017, 2018 Polish film called The Innocents, all of which deal with this topic of the rape of women by Soviet troops. But again, putting that in a broader context, as Karen had mentioned, this is something, obviously rape and war, unfortunately, are so closely interlinked, and Soviets saw it as vengeance.
Yeah, but I really think we have to put this in perspective. If we think about the German Wehrmacht and the fact that they put an estimated number of 34,000 women all over from Europe into forced prostitution.
Yeah.
They had, for the military, that, they had programs like Lebensborn, where they really took away children who were the result of Aryan-looking women from Norway or Poland or occupied parts, and brought them in homes or in institutions to be educated to good Germans. So yes, I think you have to think about this as a kind of really in a network, as a response. But the fact is, of course, that even so the German Wehrmacht practiced, for sure, rape. If it's part of the policy or not is a very heatedly discussed question. The fact stays that for the individual woman, that was a dreadful experience. Yeah. And which created a long-term memory and, an experience about which they couldn't really talk in the public in the 50s and 60s.
Thank you. Konrad, yeah.
It also made, after the war, the so-called alliance between East Germany in the Soviet Union more complicated,
Yeah.
because you had official proclamations of friendship, and then you have a kind of personal and family memory, which is full of violence and full of theft. The cliche of Uri, the German watches, that is in Russians using a German word, for stealing watches. And there's this famous photograph of the soldier, Red Army soldier, on top of the Reichstag, which they had to retouch because it turned out that on his arms he had bunches of watches. So you have a kind of memory like that then becomes cultural, and that's what makes it very difficult to know how many individual instances there are in that, because it's a kind of personal family memory that counters the official state and party memory of Soviet-German friendship.
Thank you. Lloyd, you want to come into?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a very interesting book by a French historian at the University of Wisconsin named Mary Louise Roberts. It's called What Soldiers Do, and it's about American GIs in France during the Second World War. And this has been a very difficult subject to address because of, the very positive view of what the American Army was doing in France. But she's uncovered a lot of stories about the creation of brothels, about the behavior of GIs who just presumed that French women were available, as it were. And there was also tension about Black American soldiers being with white French women, which created a lot of anger among some white American soldiers. There are many layers of complexity about sexual behavior of American GIs in France that have only recently begun to be explored.
Thank you. Will, do you have some more questions?
Yeah, I would like to comment about what Professor KRAMER just said there, that the movie Fury with Brad Pitt does, I think, a pretty good job depicting that conflict with American soldiers and French women. But to move on, the next question we have is kind of an amalgamation of a few people's questions. It's even carrying on in today, there's a lot of discussion and political conflict between leaders about who was a perpetrator and who was a victim in the Second World War. What role do these conversations about people being perpetrators or groups being victims play in today's political environment?
Konrad, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of as a typology, you have two extremes, perpetrators, victims, and then the third part is bystanders. And what recent research, has shown is that these are slippery categories, that somebody can be in one situation in the war effort, be a collaborator, at the same time, some orders that gets done to him victimizes him, and then that same person can refuse a certain kind of order and is then resisting and so on, so that I think we are beyond the sort of simple categorization, but we are understanding that in war these roles change for individuals, and that individuals by and large try to survive in a deadly environment for them, and that only sort of the most egregious perpetrators are just perpetrators, and the most suffering victims are clearly victims, and there's a lot of the great majority of the population is somewhere in between.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to come in here?
It goes back a bit to the point that Professor Jones made about the rallying of the public around Stalin and the enormous feelings when he died in 1983. I think one has to recognize that this is related to that subject. The behavior of the Germans in the Soviet Union and towards prisoners of war the Germans managed to kill or starve to death 3.5 million Soviet prisoners of war. The behavior of the German army and its auxiliaries was such that they converted, the German army converted Stalin from a feared and even hated dictator into the admired savior of his country. And one cannot, in my opinion, understand that reaction to Stalin without the prior experience. And there is a further aspect of this which is too often forgotten. Very large portions of the area occupied and ravaged by the Germans in World War II had been occupied by the German army in the First World War. There were lots of people there for whom this was the second German occupation. And while there were some incidents in the first occupation, the people there, and then by rumor and by exchange, the people in the Soviet Union as a whole, very quickly learned that this was a totally different army that did totally different things. In the First World War, unlike the Second, German soldiers didn't go into hospitals of communities they'd occupied, shoot, kill all the patients and toss them out the windows. These sorts of things were going on in the parts of the Soviet Union occupied by the Germans in World War II. And so one has to see this issue. The extent to which this continues into the present is much more difficult to say, because there has been what I would call a public reconciliation between peoples of Eastern Europe and peoples of Germany. But one cannot understand some of the post-war developments, and particularly the attitude towards Stalin, unless one keeps in mind the horrendous events which took place between the invasion of the Soviet Union and then the winter of 44, 45, when all of the Soviet Union had been cleared of German troops.
Thank you very much. Well, we are kind of overrunning our time a lot. Maybe we have 2 or 3 more final questions, perhaps summarizing questions, if you can bring several questions together. And then we'll have to say that was it. What do you think?
This is a good one that I think touches on several people's questions. How did German occupation after World War II affect European economic and social integration moving into the present day?
That's a question for Lloyd, I think.
I'm sorry, you're saying how did German occupation, you mean the occupation of Germany? Is that what?
Yes, yeah, the occupation of Germany.
Well, I think it certainly created an idea that perhaps Europe needed to be more unified economically. I feel like KONRAD would be a more, let's say, informed commentator on that particular subject. But I do think that the occupation or the memory of the war had a great impact on the desire to create the European Union. That's clear throughout the 1950s. But maybe I would prefer my distinguished colleague Konrad to give us more of the economic aspects.
Let me just ask you, don't you think that something like the European, the Schuman Plan and the EEC was only possible because of the great catastrophe of the Second World War? If it hadn't been for that really big catastrophe, would the nations of Europe even have been half prepared to pool their sovereignty and pool their resources?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's no question, and certainly that was important for even for de Gaulle, yeah, you know, and Adenauer, that you have to find a way to integrate economically to avoid another war. And I would just say I almost feel one of the tragedies of the last 5 years, which is being exacerbated by the pandemic, is that the memory of the need for that integration has been breaking down because of the conflict over immigration, above all perhaps, or the movement of labor. But now the suspicion about the pandemic is undermining the memory of the Second World War in a way that seems to be weakening the EU.
I quite
The
agree.
question was really, what to do with the defeated Germans after the Second World War. And, there was a kind of, one version was to stick it to them because they had been so incorrigible, and the second time around had done so much more damage than the first time around. And the second version was to bring them back into a community. And concretely, the coal and steel community deals really with the material to make war. And would another occupation of the Ruhr and a Ruhr struggle from 1923 be constructive? And fortunately, the generation of people in the resistance, but also people in a kind of not quite as much involved and so on, had understood that if you Europeanized the problem, you could contain the Germans and use the German economic power and manpower for something constructive that would help everybody. Whereas the other version would create a kind of donut problem. How do you reconstruct Europe without the center? And fortunately, in Western Europe, this was not done.
Thank you. Will, last but one question.
All right, so this one's pretty interesting. Greg wants to know whether any of the panelists have a particular take on the Rommel myth.
What?
What myth?
I think he's referring to the idea that Rommel was a politically ambiguous, just a strategic commander, an apolitical figure.
That's a question for Gerhard Weinberg. Can you talk to us about the importance of Rommel as as war leader in general?
Well, he was an experienced commander. He rose, especially as a result of his command of German units in the invasion of France in 1940. And he was sent to North Africa to make sure that the British, who had conquered Italian Northeast African colonies, did not lose Libya, because Hitler was concerned that if that happened, Mussolini, the advocate of alignment with Germany, might be dumped. And of course, this assessment was correct. And Rommel, you must keep in mind, was one of the few people in the high military who was personally somewhat close to Hitler, who had arranged also for his family to be to live in a house confiscated from a local Jewish community. In fact, in the summer of 42, when Rommel it looked like was going to take over Egypt and the Near East, a murder commando was attached to his headquarters so that all Jews in the Middle East could be killed before the area was turned over to the Italians, whom Hitler did not trust to do this. Then, of course, Rommel gets beaten in late 1942. And it is under those circumstances that, although he continues in the technical military way to do what he can to defeat the Allies in Northern Europe and then in Italy, and then to build up the defenses in France against an Allied invasion. But there are signs that he has doubts about the long-term prospects. And it is under those circumstances that he comes to have some contacts with opponents of Hitler in Germany's upper levels of society, and as a result, he is faced by, at Hitler's orders, with the choice of committing suicide or having a trial. And if he commits suicide, the family can keep its home. There won't be any big bad publicity about him. And under the circumstances, Rommel decides to commit suicide.
Thank you. Can we have the final question, please?
Okay, let's see. This would probably be for Professor GLATTHAAR. How concerned was the US government concerning FDR's deteriorating health? And was any preparation made in anticipation of his death or inability to serve as president?
I'm not aware of any preparations dealing with his inability to serve. I mean, he obviously was declining in health, but remember, most Americans had no perception, even that FDR, had polio and couldn't walk. So he really portrayed himself as a more vigorous man. But when you look at the photographs from Yalta, you can see clearly this is a man who's rapidly declining in health. Fortunately for FDR, we don't have that kind of visibility like you do now. And as a result, I think he was declining in health, but I don't think people were, were pretty surprised when he died. At least that's my take on the public's view.
So that is what Roosevelt and Stalin have in common, because the Soviet public was also surprised when Stalin suddenly died in 1953, as we discussed before, despite his declining health. Yeah. I would say we have had a very long evening. Before we depart, I would like to ask every one of our distinguished and great speakers to perhaps tell us his or her own personal thoughts on the commemorating the end of the Second World War, and what we perhaps should take away from that for our lives today, particularly as we, of course, are facing a difficult situation right now, though very much a very difficult situation in the current corona crisis. Can I ask maybe Jeff Jones to begin?
Yeah, let's hope it remains the worst war of all time, because if we have anything worse than this, it will just be apocalypse, I think. So, if there's a lesson to learn from it, let's strive for peace and aim for peace at all times. Pretty simplistic, I realize, but that's what I'm taking away.
Thank you. Konrad, would you like to come in?
Yeah, well, I mean, the slogan is never again. The question is just never again what? Never again war, never again Nazi dictatorship, never again Holocaust. All of those things, I think, are connected. And unfortunately, the earth is not just a friendly neighborhood, so that the possibility of war cannot be eliminated. But I think the Second World War is a war that is forced upon the Western powers and the Soviet Union. And in those situations, you have to do it. Whereas in other ones, where you start wars yourself with claims of weapons of mass destruction, which then turn out to be faulty, and so on, then I think that is the place where never again war is the lesson.
Thank you very much. Karen, would you like to contribute?
Turn on your...
Is Karen still here? Or?
Yeah, she's there.
Karen, can you hear me?
Yes.
There you go.
I muted myself because that was your direction. We should mute ourselves during the conversation. I don't want to repeat what the others said. For me personally, the lesson was really fight for peace. As I said, that was what I grew up with in my family. But in respect of the post-1945 period and the current crisis, I think what we really see is that collaboration is needed. European and global, that solidarity is needed. You know, even so, some people, especially here, tend to dismiss this very much, and that it is very helpful to have a functioning welfare state who has a social system, who has a functioning healthcare system, and other measures to really address crisis. And that is the post-war situation, as I tried to show, was a serious, big crisis, very big crisis, but that is also the fact now. So in some ways, in crisis situations, we realize that some qualities which we tended to dismiss in our neoliberal culture still have value. And that is, one is a functioning welfare state, and the second is collaboration, and the third is solidarity.
Thank you very much. Lloyd, would you like to contribute?
I would just like to comment on my takeaway from the war. I think what we see from this history is the danger of extreme nationalist ideologies which scapegoat people who are deemed to be different. I think we also see the danger of very powerful governments being led by people who tell lies, big lies, and get people to follow those lies. And thirdly, and this is my more optimistic take, I'm amazed by the resilience of human beings to come through catastrophic events, regroup, be creative, and build something new out of disaster. And this is our current situation. We're facing an unexpected crisis. So the question, how will our resilience enable us to move forward? And I think the legacy of 1945 raises an optimistic point that I want to end on.
Thank you. I like your optimism. Joe, would you like to come in?
2 points. One, tolerance. We need to be more tolerant of different peoples, different backgrounds. Secondly, utilize war as a last resort. We're too quick to go to war. I mean, Thucydides told us this. Nations go to war, and then when they suffer setbacks, then they resort to negotiations, to discussions. This is not the way we should be doing things. War should be a last resort, but first and foremost, tolerance.
Thank you. And last but not least, Gerhard Weinberg.
The memory of that horrendous event, almost certainly the worst in history, ought to remind us that as we advance technologically, actually we potentially increase dangers, and that the more powerful the society can be in the utilization of the most recent discoveries, the more dangerous that potentially is, and that therefore we have from that war an ever greater incentive to do what we can, or what we can try to do, to avoid any repetition.
Thank you very much. My own take from the Second World War and the end of the Second World War would be global cooperation. And I think that also applies very much to the current crisis which we are facing today. And I think it applies very much to what actually is the objective of the Krasno Global Event Series here at UNC Chapel Hill. This ends our series for this semester. We began in a live version as normal, and we ended up with 2 online events, but the online events have actually been quite successful. We had, I dare to say, almost more viewers than we normally have people in the room. We had almost 400 people who watched us at its peak today. And when I look now at the figure, there's still almost 120 people left, which is great. After all, we have debated for almost 3 hours, 2 hours and 3/4. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It has been a pleasure to be here tonight. We will have more Krasno events in the fall, probably starting in September 2020. Whether we can have them live or whether we have to have them online, we don't know yet, We hope, of course, it will be live and that the crisis has been overcome, but who knows for sure. At this stage, only one thing is sure, that the Krasner event series will be back in the fall in one form or another. And I would like to thank our 6 tremendous and distinguished speakers again tonight. It was great to have you here, and the debate, the presentations, everything was pretty good. Then my thanks also goes to my senior assistant, Will Yoder, who furnished us with the questions in an ideal way. And of course, also my thanks to Paul Lamont, who was our IT expert in the background. Therefore, there's not much left to say. I just would like to thank you again for watching us. Thank you again for participating, and see you again in the fall. Good night.
Thank you,
Safe,
Claude.
everyone.
Thanks. Yes.
Thank you.